I'm going to get the meeting started just because I think it's going to be a very lengthy meeting. And, you know, breaks will be available. If we need them, we'll figure that out. And please feel free to get up and get dinner because I think this could be quite the long meeting. So I'm going to call the meeting to order at 5:34. I don't have any adjustments to the agenda. Does anyone? I already told Brendan that there is an executive session he needs to be a part of, and Erin will be coming. She'll be a little bit late. Remind me, Brendan, don't let her go. Any audience and communications? Okay, I think we are ready for the regular ed. The big.
We're hoping to do for them for another year. So let's start with the agenda. So we will quickly go through some of these things because in some of the previous presentations you've heard some of the same stuff, right? But we will go over board goals, the process and timeline, and then the alignment of the proposed budget at 2.8% total budget, 2.7% on the general ed budget. With education quality standards, our own CVSD initiatives, the equity and autonomy goal that we have for ourselves, board policies, and specifically in that area around student-teacher ratios, class size, around the essential arts, that was a special focus this year, and the intervention framework and administrator ratios. So the board goals, implement the Champlain Valley School District mission and vision. And I will say that I feel very fortunate to work in an organization that has a mission that we all really care about, and we always look to ensure that we are aligned with it. Thank you for that. To realize our equity and autonomy across our schools, to implement key initiatives. So that is proficiency-based learning, personalized learning, MTSS, Success for All Students, positive climate and culture, social emotional learning, best practice in safety and security. So those are the goals that you set up for yourselves this year during the budget cycle. Meet or exceed education quality standards. And finally, at a cost that the community will support, because if that weren't there, there'd be more in this. Okay, and I just want to say right up front, there could be places in this that you're going to go, wow, you know, like maybe that's a place where there could be more. At the end, I'll share with you where I'm nervous about this one. But you might see those places too. Feel free to interrupt me. If that's the right place for me to talk about it, I will, and if not, I'll say we're going to talk more about that at a future slide. So how many of you had a chance to look over the presentation before you came? A few. Okay, so you have some idea about what's coming. So budget development, again, you've seen this. This is work that the board did at their retreat in May 2017, and we hold to this. This is what you expect me to do in the whole budget process, and there's your role. So in terms of class size, I'm the one who's looking at what the enrollment numbers are. I go over that. You'll hear this a little bit later with the principals. And then kind of roll up the numbers to make a recommendation in terms of staffing. We do that through a general ed service planning model. And again, supports to the classroom. Again, we did a little bit of work on that this year, so we'll talk about that later. And so, for board goal, implement the mission and vision. You saw this slide last year, it hasn't changed. This is still the same mission and vision that we have. And this is still the work that we're doing around standards, around professional development, around instructional practice, around assessments, and around reporting progress. So some of the highlights there, I would say, around professional development, you heard me say this last year, it is amazing the value that we get for the work that we do with embedded professional development every single week in our schools, right? That is what ensures that the work is always in the forefront and we can move forward. And in every one of our schools, they're doing work around proficiency-based learning, around personalization, around making sure that we're doing best practice. I would also point out the reporting progress. That is work that we've been going deep into this year. All of this, I think, will be highlighted when we have our integrated field review in January. So it's all connected. Board goal, meaningful involvement of principals. So this lovely chart looks like, there's like, let me see, 2 cycles of this work, but in fact, there are at least 3 cycles of the work. And it starts with a general ed service planning meeting. When we merged, we decided we would take a page out of the special ed playbook and meet with administrative teams from each of the schools and do what they do in special ed in general ed. Have a sit down with Jean there, with Megan there, with Mark there, with Jeff there, and with the principals from each of the school in their own schools, and look at what are they seeing for staffing? What are they seeing for needs and supports? What are the things that are going on in their schools that we need to hear about? And we're all hearing that. And this is like an hour-and-a-half or 2-hour meeting that then goes back to Colt, because all of Colt was at that meeting to go back and say, so now we know what we heard from each of the individual principal groups. What does that mean for budgeting and starting to plan our resource thinking around for all the schools? And then it goes to lead, so that the principals get a chance to hear from each other what they're thinking. And then I, just by myself, go and meet with the principals in a second round to say, okay, I have some questions about this. Or here's some numbers that I've crunched since we met the first time, and now let's look at that. So when we get to the part, those of you who have seen the presentation, where we're looking at paras, I'll explain a little bit about what that project was about and how that worked. And then it goes back to Colt, goes back to the principals. That's a cycle. I will also say in terms of this, because Lynn gave me a prompt early, maybe on the weekend, saying, like, are you going to be talking about that? And I knew I was. But on Monday at LEAD, we had a conversation about how do the principals involve their faculties, right? And so I heard from the principals different things, right? Not everyone does exactly the same thing, but around the horn, some people have decision packet process still. Some people meet with their leadership team and program council in a very structured way. Others do it more through faculty meetings. But one of the things that came out of this very rich conversation, I thought, was a decision to put that on our work plan, to figure out, like, what should that look like? And one of the principals said, honestly, when we merged and the board kind of took the decision packet process off the table, a process that had been in the old CSSU schools for probably, I don't know, since the last century, let's just say, that it left a void, right? So now how do we do that? There had been a very robust way that we were asking teachers, and now we kind of changed that. So it left a void for a year. We're on it. That'll be part of the work plan for next year. The principals are also very interested in how does that connect with grants that teachers get from, like, FAP, or PIE, the PI groups, the parent-teacher groups, and the innovation grants. So that's work that we need to do. But I would say that we have a model for how we do it, we have a structure, and we're going to be improving it. Board goal, budget alignment with the education quality standards. Let me just say, you got this via email, right? So that means you have the link there, the Vermont Education Quality Standards, and you could spend, like, a good part of some evening reading them. It's actually very good work, so I'm just going to go breeze really quickly through this. The points that I think are important for the board to have, so that you know that these are the things we have in our own head when we're thinking about how we're asking for resources from the community. So the purpose of the educational quality standards was to ensure that there'd be equal opportunities for all students in Vermont. That's nice. It very much aligns with this board's and this administration's own commitment to that. It requires that the school boards use the updated standards for curricular methods of instruction, assessments, and the content and skills that are taught and learned. You'll see later that they get very specific about that. And that there's an annual report to the public, and we've been doing that for years. That the instructional practices promote personalization, be research-based, that there be, thank you, focus on flexible pathways. So work-based learning, service learning, dual enrollment, that's more focused on at the high school level. And that students must be, so it doesn't say may be, that was a huge shift when these new education quality standards were developed. Students must be allowed to demonstrate proficiency by demonstrating multiple types of evidence. So not just a final exam, that's not it. Education quality standards that high schools have to coordinate with the tech centers, and personalized learning plans. And you'll see that in here it says grades 7 through 12. I personally was on that commission. I argued long and hard and wasn't on the winning side of that argument that this should start at kindergarten. In our system, we believe it should start at kindergarten. It shouldn't look the same at kindergarten as it looks at the high school. But a kindergartner can tell you what they're good at doing, what they like to learn, and start building a portfolio of who they are as learners. And then that can transition to how does that relate to things that they might do in their life, right? So for us, the requirement is 7 through 12. We're really going way beyond that. I don't know, Jeff, do you want to say anything more about that, or that
Just
same?
You know, we're doing a lot of work. We're at various stages, but I think quite a few schools have embraced the idea of embedding personalized learning experiences before 7.
Yeah.
But we really are focusing on making some alignment in the 7-12 right now.
That there's written and delivered curriculum that's aligned with the standards. We've done that work. And that students are annually, let's say forever and always, engaged in rigorous, relevant, and comprehensive learning opportunities in all of, let me back that up, in all of those areas. Right? So all of the areas that we would think of as the content of the work that we do in schools, literacy, math, science, global citizenship. Phys ed is the only one that's called out with a statute. So that's an interesting thing, right? In our statutes, there is a phys ed requirement. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Artistic expression and transferable skills that for us just is so lovely. It lines up perfectly with our mission. So EQS, instruction and leadership. So this is where the class size stuff comes in. That K through 3 taken together, when you take the full number of students that we have, K through 3, that the average per teacher is 20 or less. And at 4 through 12, the average per teacher is 25 or less. The total class roll of a teacher shall not exceed 100 students, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And that schools with 10 or more full-time equivalent teachers, I will just add right there parenthetically, that's every one of our schools, shall employ a full-time licensed principal, and if you have more than 10, then you'll employ licensed principals commensurate to the need that you have. Library media, we will come back to that a little bit too. Schools with over 300 students have to have a full-time librarian. School counseling, no more than 300 students per school counselor and other student support personnel. So that's the notion that you can have a counselor and other support personnel to meet that standard. And at the secondary level, no more than 200 students per school counselor and other support personnel. And school nursing, no more than 500 students per school nurse. You might remember last year we needed to do some work to fix a couple of those areas. And this is where we found that. So on this particular page, which is mostly about the instructional practices, you'll see it's all pluses. I'm saying to you, we meet those standards. School leadership, and a little more definition here than what was in that introductory stuff, we meet those. Besides making sure that they're licensed, that they're part of a team, that they have professional learning opportunities, that we ensure that principals have, and our leaders have time, not just to do the instructional leadership, but to also time to do other things with students, right? So that they're not just in an office doing their work, but they're, yes?
Just to clarify, that's for FY19 we meet it, or is that on the FY20 budget, we'll meet that?
We will meet that on the FY20 budget.
Okay, that's,
Staff evaluation, same thing. We have a, I will say this, though, staff evaluation, we've had 2 design teams around this work, and we have conversations about this all the time. So that is something that's so really very, very important and very, very time consuming, and we're always trying to figure out, like, all the energy that we put into it, what are we getting out of it, and is there a better way to do it? So we meet it, but it is a focus of the work that we do. So EQS, tiered system of supports, school counseling, we meet that as we sit. We will be having more conversation about that later on in this presentation. Coordinated school health, we do have a CVSD prevention framework. It's linked there, so you can access that and can see that. I asked Megan for that document, and she gave it to me, and she said, that's not very pretty. So it's just a functional document that we use to make sure that we can put a check mark there, but it's got all the right information. So that's a place to go to see how are we determining that we meet that comprehensive, or the prevention framework. School nurse, we meet that one. Library media, so it turns out, last year, I had all those green boxes there, just like I do this year. But I was making the assumption that we met it everywhere based on, remember what I just said about school counselors, that you can say the person, the professional and the supports. So I was translating the school quality standards to mean the same thing. And in one of our schools, we didn't quite meet that number, but we had hair support, staff support for that library. So later you're going to hear why I'm saying now we need that this year in a different way. And class size sections, CVU is left blank because honestly we do have sections that are over 100. You'll see that too later. So I didn't, in all honesty, I couldn't put a plus sign here. Any questions about that before we move on? So the next board goal is equity and autonomy, and tonight specifically around student-teacher ratios, class size, the essential arts, the intervention framework, and administrator ratios. So I just put this slide in there because there's a group of us who have been working with the district management group. Remember, that is the group that did the work with us around special ed maybe 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and then subsequently the legislature hired them and provided money for other schools to do that same work. And then, 2 years ago, the legislature contracted with them to do the work around the special ed funding. So they've been very involved in Vermont for a long time. The work that we did, Colleen and Joan Lennis were the 2 board members who were working with us on this. There were different principles depending on what the topic was. Megan and I were always there. And we developed roles and responsibilities for probably about 30 different areas. It really provided very good clarification for us as we were merging. And then we would bring that back to the principals and the lead group to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So in terms of class size, that's the work that we put out there. You'll see I've linked the class size policy and the EQS. So in Champlain Valley School District, rolling up the numbers. So this is how I did that. I took the kindergarten numbers and I moved them up to first grade, and I duplicated that number in the incoming kindergarten. We learned last year that that is the trickiest class to predict, that and 9th grade. Really hard to know what the real numbers are. And so we are doing much earlier. I had suggested February or March kindergarten registrations, but I learned yesterday that people have already started kindergarten registration.
There was an early pre-registration, it was like a Google form, and
Yeah.
I know we passed it last week.
Yeah, so we're gonna have a much better sense, but, you know, we're also gonna track the numbers over the next few years so that we can see start developing our own numbers. And probably still, every 3 to 4 years, we'll ask the NASDAQ to do the numbers for us. But honestly, they're not very good at kindergarten and ninth grade either. Their numbers are no better than ours. So right now, as we sit, when we're thinking ahead a year and we roll up the numbers, kindergarten, the average for kindergarten across the district is 17.2, and the range is 16.8 to 19. EQS says 20 or less. 4 through 8, actually K3, 18.5, and then the range 17.8 to 19. You know what that means, right? There's a school that has 17.8 average and another that has 19. At the middle level, 20.86 is the average. EQS says 25 or less, so those numbers are good. That doesn't mean they're great in every single grade level, and we'll see an example of that in a bit, but when we just look at what the EQS says, those numbers are good. High school, that is really hard to figure out, and there are other things that Adam would say are much more important, like how many sections do we have over 25? So you'll see that information also. Okay, so now, K3 at CCS, that's 19. That's the number that, like, if I were going to look at a number right there, makes me a little bit nervous, right? 19 is high. However, if I did K2 at Charlotte, the number would be 17.4. And that's because Charlotte has a grade 2 class currently of 23. So they have 2 sections of 23. And that grade obviously is moving up. They've been 23 this year with some support from a para, right? And that's moving up. So it's not as bad as it looks, but it's concerning a little bit. So at the bottom, I learned last year when I did this presentation that it was confusing to board members about like what was really happening. So I want to be really clear. At Charlotte, we're decreasing 1 teacher. When you see those numbers there, K through 3 at 19, 4 through 8 at 21.3, and total FTE at 18. This year they were at 19, next year they're going to be at 18. Heinsberg, similar story. Last year they were at 27, this year they're going to be at 26. Shelburne, same story. Last year, I'm going to hold Shelburne in a minute because it's going to be a little bit different. Williston adds 2. Their numbers, we learned kindergarten last year when by the time we were finished the budget process, they were already at 20. So we're adding a kindergarten teacher and we're adding a 1-2 teacher because those numbers are moving on, causing that bubble. Shelburne, actually, we're removing 2 teachers, but we're holding 1 in the budget, just like we did last year, because we're not so comfortable with all of those kindergarten numbers. We'll know sooner than we did last year, but we're not that comfortable. So we're holding a position in the budget to fill in if we need to. Okay, so this slide makes me very nervous. So I could show you the project that I did this year, which related to how much para support is there really for teachers in each of our schools, and how do you figure that out where in some schools they hire outside people to do lunch and recess supervision, and other schools their paras do that. So I did this whole project where I worked with the principals in several cycles and lots of emails back and forth to figure out, okay, here are the people that do lunch and recess. Normalize the numbers. This is how much you're spending for lunch and recess supervision. And so if you've got your paras doing that, then that doesn't count as para support. That counts as lunch and recess support. So when I back out that number for all the schools, this is what I end up with. So in Heinsberg, they have 8.5 paras that are support to classroom teachers. That's what their job is. The job description in each of the schools might be a little different. The title that we use for these people are different, and that's work that we'll need to do. But basically, in Heinsberg, they have 8.5 paras, and when I divide that into the number of students they have, it's 1 to 61. In Shelburne, they have 11, once I've backed out recess and supervision, and that's 1 to 66. And in Williston, they have 12.3, and that, the ratio ends up being 1 to 180. In Charlotte, there really are only 2 parents. And so like if I do that ratio, well, you can do the math as easily as I can. That's a huge ratio, and that seems like a real inequity. So you don't have this in your packet, because I added it later. This is the visioning that we're kind of doing, and in the process of doing this work, like I said, it was like several iterations of working with the principals and talking about it. The notion is that those are classrooms. The little boxes inside, those are classrooms. And I've got 4 there, but it could be 4, it could be 6. You could think about a grade level team or 2 grade level teams. In some of our schools, you could think of a house. But there would be a team of teachers, and structurally, we would organize them with the supports around them. And around that team of teachers would be a special educator, and we've been doing that work for some time now, figuring out how do we embed special ed in a structured way to support our kids and our teachers. There would be a team para for a cluster of teachers, and perhaps that para would be the person that would go out with those kids for recess and lunch. Personally, I think that's a better model because they know those kids, right? They know the teachers, they know the kids. It's not yet another adult who's only there for a little bit. And there would be perhaps behavioral supports, and that kind of like evolved over the conversations that I was having with different principals. So I could also pull out like all the little drawings that we did, not on the back of napkins, but on the back of the sheets that I had. And a lot of this came from them. You know, when I would say, well, what about like, how would we decide? What's the need there? You know, if I back up and I look at Charlotte, what is the need? Is it to get them to the same level as the others? And that's what got us to this conversation. So there's no money in the budget to do this right now. Yeah.
Can you differentiate the para support from the behavioral?
Yeah. So behavioral supports, we're going to talk about that when we get to social emotional learning. So that's planning room, that's your behavior coaches, your behavior interventionists. Right now, we don't have a model that looks like this, and it was one of the principals, sitting right here, who said, what about organizing, structuring our schools like this? I love this because then, imagine that, and I'm going to get to you outside, but imagine that you have a year where you do have high class size numbers in a cluster of, grade 1, 2, for example. Well then, if we're looking at a model like this, we don't just say, oh, we need another teacher. Oh my gosh, now we're going to have class sizes of 13. We can also say, well, we could look at that, but that doesn't seem to be like exactly the right solution. Or we could say we need more para support. Or depending on who the kids are that are coming in, we need more special ed support. Or depending on the needs of the students, we need more behavioral support. So we don't just jump to like it's all about like the class size. It can also be about like what are the supports that we provide in that structure.
Well, first with the question, paras and TA, are these
Interchangeable.
interchangeable and job descriptions are interchangeable?
It's the same
or-
job description. It's just that it's not necessarily how people have done it, right? It's the same job description. In some schools, they say, oh, our paras never do this. And in other schools, they say, our paras always do this. And then people say, oh, don't call it a para because you're asking them to do lunch duty, so now they have to be called a TA. But that's totally just all making it up, right? So I think we need to figure out what is the support that we need for our kids and our teachers. Make sure that the job description works. I think it does because we did that work last year. And then make sure that we're all using the same language. And
I have a
Yeah.
follow-up question about what you were just saying about this model that you're playing with. And I see the thinking, and certainly makes a lot of sense, but also, and this is hypothetical if it's not happening yet, but makes me a little bit concerned if we're thinking about higher class sizes and the same resources, the DMG report and things talking about the most important being
yeah.
most highly qualified teacher in the room and the ratio of the students to teacher. So behavior specialists maybe, but like paras and TAs.
So I
as a way
wasn't
to-
thinking that
yeah.
this was so that we could have higher class sizes. When I said that, I was just saying, like, we do end up in a situation, we have both years where we look at, you know, a grade level, if you've got 2 classes and you've got 46 kids, that's a difficult number if you're in K-1, 2. Because you're gonna have 23 or you're gonna have 15. And if you think about equity across the district, it becomes really hard. But if you start thinking about, like, what other things could we do, it's easier to do those other things if you're in a coherent system where things are structured the same way. Megan, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, in relation to the DMG report, the para support to this model isn't to provide intervention. It's to support teachers on all of those non-student things that they need support with. So, so to that point, it isn't sort of hoping that paras in a model will provide intervention. It's actually, if anything, it's taking work off of the teachers so that they're freed up to do intervention.
So the other thing I want to say, so we've had so many conversations about that, Megan and I, and then bigger groups, about we are really committed to making sure that the kids who have the greatest needs are getting instruction from the person who is the most skilled at providing that support, right? So it doesn't mean that a para or a TA, whatever, can't read a book to a group of kids, or can't, if the teacher notices that Megan's having a hard time adding fractions, say, look, I'm gonna work with, this is the teacher, I'm gonna work with Megan. Can you just go follow up, make sure those kids are on task when they're doing that work, right? And we just need to sort that all out.
So I'm guessing that this 1 to 175 isn't a goal.
No.
It's a problem.
It's to me, it's a challenge.
And it's something that might make
Said
you
about it
nervous about,
yesterday.
it's something that might make you nervous about this budget, or it'll come, okay.
It does make me nervous about this budget, because there's nothing in there about that. And then you'll see why else I could be nervous, you know. But. So the next board goal is equity, autonomy, and the essential arts, K-8. And this is the work that the DMG group that included Colleen and Joan Lennis, Jean and Megan and several principals and I did. You can look at that. So here we are, and this is the same message as last year. When you look at the overall ratio, how many FTE that each of our schools have for essential arts, it looks equal enough, right? It's in the ballpark. And it's probably the level that they need, right? So let's think of this as a closed system. This is the level they need, 1 to 62 to 71. But when you look at the individual areas, and then you look at art, and oops, sorry, wrong button. You look at art and you see, well, there's 1 to 511, and here's 1 to 289. Or in music, here's 1 to 326, and 1 to 195. PE, substantially equal. Why? Because it's in statute. Makes it really easy. World languages, again, 1 to 179, 1 to 361. And then the only school that has a program for family consumer science and tech ed is Williston. So they have, it's 1 to 598. So basically they've got 2 people that do that. But that's rolled into these numbers. FACS and tech ed is rolled into that number. They're at 1 to 71. So again, like in the big picture, every school has what they need in terms of FTE in the essential arts. The real question that the board asked last year is, we see all that variation. If the outcomes are the same, fine. If the outcomes aren't the same, then maybe we want to hear a recommendation. So actually what we discovered, well, let me back up. Did I go too fast? No. So I want to talk a little bit about library media. It's really not a essential arts, but I needed to put the slide in someplace and put it in here. Last year at Williston, at ABS, Allenbrook School, we had a .8 library person. They have over 300 kids. I calculated that they met school quality standards because they had a .6 para support, and I thought that those 2 things. But they are challenging that, And by the challenge, I took that to mean they prefer to have a full-time librarian. So you'll see when we do like the full accounting at the end, that we traded in partial para, it's a go-get, for adding the .2 at ABS. So we now meet that. I thought you'd also want to see what it looks like across the system, though. So now, we do have some recommendations. And I'm going to get Jeff to weigh in here a little bit, because he asked George Martin, who was our data person, to get some data around how do kids do at the high school. Right? So let's just start with world language. In world language, we have a school that starts world language instruction at grade 1 and goes all the way to grade 8. We have a school that I think starts at grade 3 and goes to grade 8. We have a school that starts at grade 5 and goes to grade 8. And a school that starts at grade 6 and goes to grade 8. And guess what? At the high school, they all do the same. So my recommendation, and I said I shared this with Lynn earlier, is the corollary of what the board said to me. So we're not seeing any differences. That says to me that I say to the principals, you can do any one of those things, right? Within the closed system, you can start world language at grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And be really clear about what the expectations are for the results. Right? We expect that our students, if they've gone through minimum 3 years of world language, a good majority of them are going to be able to test into Spanish 2 or French 2 when they get to the high school. That's the goal. That means, just to be perfectly clear what I'm saying, that a principal could say, in a school where they start world language at grade 1, let's say, they could say, I would prefer within the closed system and that FTE to use some of that FTE to do something different that I think would be more valuable for my kids. And in fact, there's at least one principal who does want to do that and is excited about doing something that seems to be a hole in the system. So that's the recommendation around world language. Do you want to add anything? I know.
No, I think that captures the world language piece as well.
Aaron?
What do you, when you say they do the same, is it like proportionally the same from each town is entering at that second level, or?
There is some variance. What we found was there was no discernible disadvantage for the school started in 6th grade in terms of participation levels in Spanish 1, French 1, Spanish 2, French 2, or beyond. So there was no cause effect between when you started and what they were taking in high school.
Is there statistical significance for the number of kids that switch from one language to another between 8th and 9th?
No, not really. There was no, there's no corollary there.
Any other questions about that? So I'm kind of looking at it, the autonomy is back at the local schools, right? Equity autonomy piece. The equity piece is if you start here, you're getting the same results as if you start here. So it's totally within your autonomy to decide how you want to use that.
This is a real basic question.
Yeah.
I'm getting confused on the years, the fiscal years for the data. So the ratios are for this current fiscal year or the recommendation for the budget?
Yeah, for the recommendation for the budget. I will tell you that the numbers.
Okay, so when we saw the Charlotte
Yes.
ratios, for example, and you said it might be a concern for the budget,
Yeah.
that's like baseline
For
budget for
FY20.
FY20.
Yes.
And then all the subsequent slides are all FY20.
I believe so.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Jocelyn?
Do we know if there's no significant difference for the kids coming from towns who go on to like French 4, Spanish 4, or French 5 and Spanish 5?
Highest level.
Yeah, like the highest level, just because I know that usually sets kids up better for college if that's the route that they're going. So I'm just wondering if they continue on or not.
Yeah, that's a level of detail we hope to get to, but in terms of our initial
Yeah.
recommendation, we were looking at participation once they start.
It's sort of like the question, the thing about that is it's easier to get to French 4 and 5 if you start on the French 2.
Right, right.
Or Spanish 4 and 5 if you
Yeah.
start on that.
to 8, you're teaching French and Spanish only? Is there anything else in 1 to 8?
In 1 to 8, in one school, they're teaching Spanish only.
Okay.
And in the other school, I think they're teaching both.
Okay, and then what are the options in 9 to 12? French, Spanish, and anything else?
Latin.
Okay, so French and Spanish.
We did have a Chinese program for a while, and I think it was
The
popular.
language arts advantage, it's not really a language.
Anybody else have a question or a comment they want to make at this time?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, switch from.
Well, Elaine, I think it's, you might look at this and say, well, why is the community funding language starting earlier if it doesn't make a discernible difference? And I think it's just really important to remind the board that the bottom line, essential arts is about this equitable in all the buildings. So if you want to make that comment about another need for,
Yeah, so the thing about this, that's why I keep saying it's a closed system, and why I said, that ratio that we saw what the schools need, because remember, and I always keep saying this because I think it sounds like I'm dismissing the importance of the essential arts, because I really believe they're very important. Some kids, it's the best thing that happens to them in school, it's the way they learn. But the fact is, in the structure of our systems, we need to have things like world language and all of the essential arts so that we have time for our teachers to have time to collaborate with each other, planning time for them to have their lunch. And that's about the amount we need, it looks like. But how it's distributed might not be the way that if we're taking a hard look at what we want for our kids, that we would say, oh, that's what I want for our kids. Yeah, Kelly?
Just to Jocelyn's point, I totally understand putting the ownership back into the school, like the individual
the
schools and the autonomy. But I would just caution the earlier research in the sense that I really would be curious to see for those that end up in the more senior levels of a language, how early were they exposed to it?
Right, so I should have started with the research, because I wrote that there and then I totally glossed over it. This is not new research, I shared it with Charlotte back when they were an individual board and they were talking about this. The research clearly says if to have any appreciable difference in when you start, if you start early, you have to have it much more immersed, right? So having world language 30 minutes a day for first grade, there's no difference, the research would show, to starting in 6th grade and doing it because, right?
Because
that's what the research,
because the way the
cognitive-
lesson is being taught,
Well,
right?
because there's not enough time. If you've
Yeah.
got kindergartners and they're only getting it 30 minutes a day, they're not doing the kind of cognitive work that you need to do in a world language to actually learn the world language. And so when does that happen? It happens right around 6th grade. Because that's probably more, I'm not positive about this, but I'm thinking it's likely more the time when teachers start looking at French 1 books and saying, okay, what's the expectation here? So the research is, you've seen the research, right, Lynn? It's really, and I know Jeff has too.
There are different levels of proficiency, and we haven't said that we want all of our kids to, and I don't, that was so many years ago, I don't remember the different levels of proficiency, but basically it's frequency and duration determine,
Right.
And immersion if you want to be at the highest level of proficiency, and we've not stated that as a goal.
Right. Did that answer your question?
Well, I just caution, not necessarily coming out fluent. It's coming out, it's having those language skills that are the jumping off point to go to a 4-year degree and having the background of a language. Because I would also argue, as a career language person, that the language that I started in 8th grade and then I stopped, but continued on in a different language and then subsequently went back to, like, it doesn't matter if I speak Russian, Polish, or Czech.
Right.
Your ear is
Right.
geared in tune, and so it's a learning process, less about the language itself and more about the art of learning to study a foreign language. And so that's what I'm concerned about.
And you're concerned that we get to that better?
Well, I'm just
Start
concerned
earlier?
that, like, if we just look at, okay, so if a person gets it in 6th grade, are they gonna be just as good as if they start in 8th grade? But I think it's interesting to note that And given, I understand the time requirements, and I oversimplified what you said, but I just think, like, I want to know in senior year, those kids that are in Spanish 4 and 5 and are really like enjoying a language and a process of language, because a lot of it is ease, right?
So I want to say something that I thought I had said, but it's hidden back there in my head, I guess. I am not recommending that we say they start any later than 6th grade. I'm saying that would be, I hate using this word, minimal. We would expect that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, so spot
We
on.
would be able to say, oh, we're just going to do world language in 8th grade. I think we do that too. You know, the
Kyle,
conversation
did
we're
you-
having about.
Kyle?
Going back to the library media stuff,
Yeah.
the ratios of like staff seem to go with the student population and everything. Is there any difference in the resources that are available between schools?
There is based on, let me get back to the slide. So you can see right there, CVU, our biggest school, has the highest.
Right.
FTE, Williston, our next biggest school, has the next, and Shelburne and Heinsberg both have 1.0. I will say this, the resource that they have in Shelburne is a higher level resource, even though it's at the support staff level, than the other two.
I think it means materials.
Yeah. Huh?
Spending.
Oh, materials?
Computers.
Oh, well, thank you for that. So we had that conversation too. So it turns out that in the current year, yes, lots of differences. But I shared that with all of the principals once we realized that. And it turns out that when we were doing, I'm trying to make this quick, when we were merging, the first year we were just figuring out like what's going to stay locally and what's going to be part of the Champlain Valley School District. Central office is going to have responsibility. And so we just in that first year gave it all to, said, here you have it, principals. In year 2, when June came along, we made sure that there's equitable resources in that pot of money. So there hadn't been. We made sure we had to, actually, I think in last year, the way we handled that was by giving one school more money to make sure that it became equal. So we didn't take any money from anyone. Maybe we did. We did. We equaled that out. And then we kind of stepped out of it and said, you have autonomy. Well, it turns out that autonomy is great, but you know what? These people, they'd like to know what everybody else is doing because it's a little bit illuminating. So this year, we looked at that. And what I can tell you is that's going to look, the resources part, I don't have a slide for it, will look a lot better next year because everybody has seen. So it turns out we had, you know, a huge difference. I mean, maybe some of you saw the flyer that was out when you had your
Budget
community
forum.
Right, where they had jotted that out. So we are working on that. We think it's going to be a whole lot better. The goal is to have that, yeah. The fact is that in some of our schools, the PTO or the FAPAC or the PI group also support the library. And we're staying right out of that, right? But that's also a resource to the library that is not, doesn't show up on a budget sheet. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Lee, if I could just, because we probably should have put a slide in here, but that's because it came up in the community forum questions too, just to reiterate. So the non-personnel related budget for each school is, in this current year we're in, and the next year's budget is equal per pupil. So, you know, the spending on books or materials or anything that's not related to the people, which is, you know, we keep budgets at the FTE, you know, that's the kind of things that Elaine's taking you through. And the people the dollars that don't relate to an FTE, that are just dollars cash out the door, is equal per pupil between the K-8s. It's a little bit different at the high school.
Okay. Ready to move on to music? So we did not quite as deep a dive in music, because honestly, Jeff and I did a little bit of work a couple months ago looking at, I sent for books from the National Art Council and the National Music and whatever. And here's what I really can tell you that I know to be true. If we followed the national standards on everything, we would be going to school 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And I don't know when we would ever be doing math, science, social studies. Because the people who write those standards have a passion. It's the thing they love, and they want every kid to love it as much as they do. So we're relying on the education quality standards that considers all of that. So we did do a dive into music because it's the area that seems to be the most disparate. And so maybe you could speak to that.
Yes, we found a range of one school, and it's mostly, we find more variance in the middle level in terms of expectations than we do in the K-4s. And that variance will range from, at one end of the spectrum, schools requiring general music, even if you're taking choir or band.
Or both.
Or both. So you could
Can I just
theoretically
interject
take all
here?
three.
So you could have a kid that has more music than he has math or literacy. Right?
All the way to a school that actually has some middle-level kids taking no music whatsoever. And so that really was the range. And so,
So what we learned from that is that doesn't seem to be a connection between having
Right.
general music, for example. That's a key area of difference. In some of our schools, once kids are in band and chorus, if they are in band and chorus, they don't have to be in general music. In one of our schools, you have to take a music class, right? You have to choose general music or band or chorus. You can't not. But in one of our schools, when they stop general music, kids can just opt out of music. So since we found no difference, and since we know what the education quality standards are, and we've read the national standards, we'd like to recommend that we say, you have to have some music all the way through, K through 8. But that music, once you start in 5th grade, you could opt into either band, chorus, or general music. Right?
right. And the data we looked at is participation data once they get to high school. And again, there was no discernible difference with the school, between the school who has some kids not taking it all and the school who requires general music regardless of what else you're in.
You probably have this figured out.
I probably not. I wish.
So, looking at the data, and if you have kids that opt out and are not taking music, do we know the reasons that they're not doing it? And, for example, does it conflict with another option at a school that they would prefer to participate in, or they're between
I don't think that's the situation.
No.
So in one school, they offer general music only through grade 6. And so the opt-out is, I don't want to do band or chorus.
Right.
That's what we'd like to change. We'd like to say, you have to have a music option for all kids. All kids ought to be in music through grade 8. That's what the education quality standards say. But being in band or chorus can count for kids. I'm guessing more kids will opt for band and chorus. In that school, more kids will now participate in band and chorus than they.
Okay. So
At
my
before.
question was around scheduling conflicts, and
Right.
you know, I don't,
Well-
I know that it's different at each school because of just
Yep.
scheduling is a nightmare.
And due to that and some other considerations, we're talking about what is the ramp on for that, and that it is.
So there could be a
immediate, and that-
2-year.
Yeah, that we need to support whatever constructs are
So
getting
it's
in the way.
not like they choose between Algebra 1.
No,
and
it's not,
band.
no.
Oh, no way.
No, but it's a fair question. No, it's a fair question.
No, this goes back 20 years.
Yeah.
to my-
Yeah, but thank you. No.
Okay.
But what, I mean, in one school, I
Yes.
know that that situation doesn't happen because the child who is in band or chorus and general music doesn't get time in the middle of the day to work on their classwork in a free period. That's substituted with band or chorus.
So now what we're recommending is that that student wouldn't have to be in general music. The student would have to, starting in grade 6, elect band or chorus or general music or all three if they wanted, but they wouldn't have to. Just
So
to be
general
really
music
clear.
would no longer be a requirement because that child would
It's an
fulfill it.
option.
Yes.
It's an
And
option.
that makes sense.
So both ends of the spectrum are going more towards the center. Like the school that didn't offer general music in 7th and 8th grade would now have to. And then the school that required that you be in general music, even if you're in band or chorus, you would not be required to take general
Right.
music as well. So it would be this,
That school has the autonomy to make that decision
oh,
on
I
that
see,
end.
I see.
The minimum
Yeah,
end,
you
even
could-
though we don't like using the minimum,
Thank you.
that's a school that's going to
I
have
see.
to make some changes.
I see.
The other one can choose.
So I would just parenthetically add that we are also doing work around the master scheduling. right? So we're working with DMG on that. We just talked about it again on Monday. We're going to be moving forward so that we can, in a really strategic way, look at how can we develop the best schedules that, support our kids the best.
Are kids in K through 8 are they paying fees, probably particularly band, but to be in during the day band or chorus program, are there extra fees to do that at all?
No, right? No.
Well, you
You have
rent
to
the
rent,
instruments.
yeah.
Oh, to rent the
Yeah.
instruments.
Well,
And I'm sure there's,
I think we also, though, I think every school has instruments that can be used by kids who can't afford an instrument. Nobody's shut down because they can't get an instrument. Any other questions or comments?
I would just say that, like, the way you describe this change, it sounds a little bit different than the way and I don't know if the one particular school I'm thinking of, which is Shelburne. Like, what? Sample size of
number one.
25%.
He's gonna tell you that we're,
Well, I guess what I think is like, band and chorus is always in this one particular part of the day. And so kids who aren't in band or chorus, like, they get this opportunity to sit and work on things, work in groups, work with the teacher. So if kids aren't going to general music and they're
and they're in
going to band and chorus,
I get where you're going.
how
Scott,
do
you
you
want to chime in?
coordinate? How do you coordinate that?
I'm sure Scott would love to.
And here's the thing, you don't even need to explain the whole thing to me, but it's like, I see that ability to work together as a great benefit for certain kids, and if it's scattered around, it sounds strange to me, or it sounds difficult to me, for the kid.
Maybe more difficult, but I think the concern that we have is by having band and choir happen at the same time as our sixth period, you're basically making intervention available to students, and that's predicated on whether they take band or choir. So if you're in the band or you're in chorus, you don't get that tier 2 intervention during that time that's available to other students.
That's 100% the way I would go. Because you're right, because when kids don't go to that, they get that benefit. When they don't go to band and chorus, they get that benefit. So what you're saying is, this frees up an opportunity for someone to go to band and chorus and get that intervention.
we're figuring that out.
Possible.
Sounds great to say it. You've got to build it into a schedule that works for the whole school in a K-8 environment, but that's what we're hoping to.
And that's what we're working on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because brain development through music is amazing, and nobody knows I mean, everybody knows that nobody talks about it more than I do. It's my great story that I always tell when we talk about consolidation. But I have seen on a non-statistically valid sample size that not going to band and chorus has made an incredible difference in one person's life, so.
Positive one?
Very positive.
So we don't want to
And
take away
avoidance.
from that.
Power.
No, yeah.
So I think it's important for the board to know that when we delve into an area like this, it's because the board talks about year-round budgeting, so do we. We just talk about year-round instructional practice, so we hear from the principals. Here are the challenges that we have. So when we get to this point in the year and we have an opportunity to grandstand for a couple hours, whatever, it's important that you hear. But I don't want you to think that, like, at the central office, 3 to 5 of us are like inventing this stuff. It's coming from all of the deep conversations that we have with individual principals, with the principal groups, over time, right? Some of the things go back to conversations that we had at a retreat last July. So I think that's important, and I'm so glad that there are principals here who can answer these questions.
Well, I mean, there's
Because I think
nothing-
it has more power, I know that.
There's nothing greater than to have like, gee, what about this? And Scott Sebo has the answer, you know?
Yeah.
Like, well, this is what we're talking about. So you're like, wow, you mean other people have thought of these challenges and it's not just me thinking of this
Yeah.
crazy thing?
And want it to be better,
Yeah.
right? Want to make
Yeah.
sure that all kids have that opportunity.
All opportunities are available for all
Right.
kids.
Right.
Yeah.
Many different avenues.
And the scheduling has a lot to do with that, so that's.
Emily, just to clarify, because this is a budget presentation, nothing on this sheet has implications on this year's budget.
No, because
The
we're saying
recommendations.
it's a
K-8.
closed
K-8.
system, K-8, or say closed system, you get the same ratios as you had before, you get the same FTE, you can move it around. I know that there's at least one principal thinking about a STEM initiative for his school. So people are thinking about it in lots of different ways. Yep.
So, Can you just summarize in 2 sentences, one for world language and one for music, what the recommendation is?
Yes.
Can they be compound sentences?
A semicolon.
Yeah.
In world language, we are recommending that the requirement is that you offer world language minimally in grades 6, 7, and 8. You can do more than that if you want, but that is what the requirement would be.
And is that French and Spanish, French or Spanish?
Right now, we have French and Spanish in all the schools.
In all,
For those grades.
okay.
This doesn't come without its challenges, but I don't think we need to bore the board with like behind the scenes what we need to make happen for this to all get realized. To Jeff's point, why it might take more than 1 year. In music, we are recommending that general music be required through grade 5, and then starting in grade 6.
We've still got to decide 5 or 6,
We're
correct?
still deciding grade 5 or 6, that a student chooses between general music, band, or chorus, but they are all required to make one of those choices. Did that do it for you?
And then that would be 6, 7, 8 at a minimum?
Yeah, at a minimum.
At a minimum, could be 5, 6, 7.
But just, can I just clarify one thing? You said general music and, or band or chorus. You mean general music, band, and or. You could still take band and chorus.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Take all three.
Okay.
I don't think anybody says yes, yes.
Well, I just heard-
Plenty of kids do band and chorus, we don't want to.
So Elena, with
Yes.
the requirement for 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, that all students take one of those 3 areas of music.
Mhm.
When you look at a school like Williston that has such a high ratio of 1 to 326, will staffing change to accommodate now
Likely.
this requirement?
Likely, right?
And
So-
what, do you know?
So
what that
that's why
will-
we're saying this is probably a 1 to 2, 2
So
year.
it's not in this new budget?
Well,
there.
it's in the budget in this way, because we're not taking away any FTE, and we're saying that level of FTE is sufficient to make that happen. That means that if you take it out of music, you're putting it someplace else. And that's an equity issue, but it is also a structural requirement for us to meet our other contractual obligations, right?
And maybe Greg might want to chime in there because they have a unique circumstance over there in terms of how they deliver their EA in
Right.
cycles.
Yes. So currently, with the ratios you see, we are able to offer general music all the way through 8th grade, as well as students having the option for band and chorus. And we do that through a little bit of a unique essential arts rotation system, so that students attend phys ed, for example, for 6 or 7 weeks straight for every day. And then they shift rotations and attend music for 6 weeks, every single day. Then they shift to art. So the whole system goes through this cycle, starting in grade 5, and it works.
Okay.
But I will also say that, similar to Shelburne, we are about to embark in a really deep dive in terms of master schedule, because we're having some of the same challenges relative to opportunities to provide students with intervention and not having to make tough choices between certain programmatic offerings and giving kids intervention with them.
Yeah, Colleen?
Well, just, based on your vast experience as a band instructor, what was your director of music?
I was an instrumental music director, yeah.
Yeah, for a long time. How does what we're doing compare with what you consider best practices?
Well, I think that's tough to answer because there is so much variation around the district, so I don't know how, through what lens I'd answer that.
You're also asking the person, remember what I said about passion and. He's gonna say every day.
I know, I know you know it well,
If
so that's
we
why I
had
put you on
all
the spot.
time in the world and all the money
Right.
spent,
Yeah.
right? Right home.
We need
Okay,
longer
move on.
days, that's all.
Longer days,
Yeah.
1 to 24 hours.
CVU, lots of data here on CVU. Here are their grade enrollments, what they're rolling up anticipated next year, so the numbers are down a little. What we learned last year is that NESDEC, not that good at forecasting what grade 9 numbers will be at CVU. Neither are we yet. So whereas for kindergarten, we've made some adjustments, we're having an earlier registration, and in 2 of our bigger schools, we're also projecting what we have a project going, so that we're trying to figure out, can we figure out who are all the daycare providers and get some numbers that are more solid. At the high school, it's more difficult. The reason those numbers will go up, and they did this year by how many, Jean? Like 15, 17, something like that?
Almost 25.
Almost 25 is because kids who have opted, families who have opted to have their kids at Monte Christi or Christ the King or the Bellwether School or wherever come flocking back to CVU in grade 9 for whatever reason. We don't know. Maybe that would be a good work for us to do sometime when we had a few spare minutes to figure that out. But so that number's 1293, but it's likely to go up because that's the experience that we've had. We've shown you the number that we just. So you can see here that when you look at this chart and you look far right, what's the average right now? Class sizes in English, social studies, math, science, and core. There's not a problem with the class size number, average. EQS says 25 or less, just like it's the same as 4 through 8. So that's, information for you, just so you can have good bedtime reading material. Same with all of these, world languages, all of that. Those class sizes, not a problem. Some of them are smaller. And you'll see tech ed and family and consumer science, that's a safety issue, right? We've got machines and we've got hot plates and stuff like that. And so we have smaller class sizes in those areas. And then you can see that, so this is where, this isn't the slide that shows it the best, but it's a nice graphic representation of, in each of the core content areas, how many of their sections are over 25, how many are 20 to 25, 15 to 19, and under 15. If you're a visual person, I'll let you look at that, but I'm gonna go on to the next one, where you can zoom right in and you see math. Let's see here, where's my little thing? So here's math. We have 31 sections that are 20 to 25. That meets EQS standards. We have 9 that are over 25. We have, let's see, in English, 2 that are over 25, and 14 in social studies that are over 25. That's why I left that box white instead of coloring it green. And when we get to the next one, well, you'll see here. This is like per full-time teacher. The EQS says no teacher should have more than 100 students on their roster, right? And we have 16 in core academics that have over 100. 7 of them have over 120. Those are the 2 areas that we would be most concerned about. Yes?
I don't know if you'd be able to answer this, and maybe it's a question for Adam, but how much of that are there shifts in staffing of like the Nexus program or things where there might be some teachers with some much lower ratios or pretty different looking schedules that play into this at all?
Yeah, there also, you can see that there are under 75, 15, the freshman core, that's a different thing, but there are 4 that are under 75, and if I back up, under 15, so sections under 15, there are 4 in English, they're probably upper level classes, it's a question of who enrolls. There are not that many, and you'll notice in Nexus is 0, those classes are big. Lynn and I visited the Nexus class.
Big tank.
I mean, it's a full class, right? But there are some other classes, there are 3 in tech ed, well, that's again a safety issue. I think it would be a good question for Adam, but I don't think that that's the biggest drive.
Is there any,
Yeah?
I just look at social studies and it's an outlier with the 14 sections over 25.
Right.
Why is that? No.
I would just say historically, from when I was sitting on the CVU board and would chime in, that happens to be a core area where it's a little easier because of group work and things like that to have larger classes. This many at 25 is too high, as you'll see at the recommendation, but, you know, over time, as budget pressures came up, that was not the place that the CVU board, when I was on it, chose to invest because a history class or something could handle that more than a math class.
Right. And you know, for CVU, let me just put a little asterisk here, for CVU, this is how we see it today. This is not what the budget implications are, right? Because they haven't even done course registration yet or anything. So we really can't just roll the numbers up and say, oh, here it is now.
The numbers tend to be higher in social studies a lot because there are required courses in social studies, freshman, sophomore, junior year, but lots of popular electives in social studies, so kids double up often, and that increases our numbers.
But it's still, I guess it's concerning for me, and I don't wanna see like 7 job requests for social studies teachers in the next few years, because we gave them 14 too many classes. I look at, like, what's the follow-on effect? If there's a great benefit, I don't hear somebody saying, oh, well, the thing is we do this thing, you know, I don't hear that, but I don't hear, and I just want to make sure that there's a good story behind the 14 and there's no bad story. That's all.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can say that. You can, Jeff, I should have thought, here's Jeff right here.
No, it's,
How will you illuminate us?
no, it's, I mean, there's always a list of things that concern you, but the priorities around math have been more concerning in many respects, and some of our flexible pathways. And at least speaking from my experience, I have not had a lot of people concerned about the social studies numbers at this point.
Okay.
Well, it would be interesting to know, are those sections in the AP classes, the ones that are?
Right.
You know, where are those 14? If it's in freshman social studies, that would be concerning.
I had that.
Correct.
Yes, and I had the data, so I can.
Yeah, okay. I'm curious myself now, you know, but I can tell you that it's not one that I hear about, whereas I do hear about math. I heard about math last year, and we're gonna talk about it this year. You know, so from the teachers. So I don't think that they're shy to say, hey, here's a problem. But it is, again, like everything else, like, how much do you wanna fix it and what's the cost? Right?
What if the
you're fixing
story is that in spring of 2017, all these kids were like, I gotta learn more about social studies?
Well, it is a popular.
Well, seriously, I was
You're
I
talking to the wrong person. I'm all about social
Functioning
studies.
just fine.
Yeah,
Kids are-
and I think that the larger classes in social studies make sense. I mean, I would argue as a non-math person, I need one-on-one with math. I'm happy with a 3-person math class, right? Because it's just more conceptual and people have very definitive learning styles. Social studies is you can sit down and you can have a lecture and a wide discussion with a variety of opinions and, well, let's ask the professionals. So would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, the 3 classes that come to mind are Humans and Peace and Conflict, AP Human Geo, and AP Gov are all 3 very popular classes that's actually kind of rare that juniors can even get in because seniors sign up first and fill out those classes. And it is a lot easier to learn in a bigger, it's almost better sometimes to have a better discussion with a bigger group.
And I would say from my experience as the house director in charge of that discipline for a while and English, we had conversations with those folks when they wanted all these really cool electives, the impact it would have when you also have all these required expectations. And it's a trade-off they were willing to make. That's my memory. I may get a few emails tomorrow, but that's my memory.
In defense of social studies, since I'm a social studies teacher, I guess my concern would be, especially in a proficiency-based system, and my experience and what I'm teaching, is that so many of the core literacy skills and proficiencies are really, social studies is your other opportunity. I'm teaching literacy as much as I'm teaching social studies,
Right.
and so
Yeah.
for kids, that reading,
Good for you.
the reading, the writing, the revision, like those are intensive and smaller ratios. It'd be very hard to do that in classes over 25 and do it well and give kids the individualized, personalized, and as we try to personalize learning even more, I think that's a concerning. Any of these at that number are very concerning.
That's why I didn't shade in that box.
Yeah.
Russ?
It seems to me we've got a situation where we've got this one number that was held out as a standard that may or may not be applicable across all of the subject areas that we teach in the high school. So, even if that was published by the state or wherever that came from, should we be looking at for our own purposes that, maybe it's lower for math and science, and maybe it's higher for social studies and English, and so that we're not just looking at.
So probably the slide that we should be looking at really is, no, it's this one. How many people have caseloads over? Because that kind of gets to addressing what you're talking about. It's very different if you've got like under 100, or you've got some people have over 120. And you're talking about doing the supports for literacy, right? Brandon?
Excuse me. One thing that kept coming up as we were talking over the sections over 25 is that they may or may not be AP classes. So I would almost like to see out of these numbers how many of those are AP classes, and then I'd like to have a discussion of, is this a fair standard for an AP class? Because when you get to college, an AP class is a college class.
Right.
So if you get to college, I don't think I was ever in a college class that had less than 25 people in it. So would it be okay to teach those AP classes at a higher level of students?
So you were saying that those AP classes are some of the classes that have those high numbers. When we can get that information, I just let Jean jot it down. Yes.
Helena, this is kind of going beyond this, but this is getting so much traction here. Two-part question, I guess. One, is there any room in this, from the state in the guidelines to do other kinds of instructional models? Blended learning, and we have a big class, and is that enough?
Yeah, definitely, and I will say this, we will have our independent field review in January, where they'll come and they'll look at everything we're doing, and they'll give us a gold star, or they'll say, here are commendations, here are recommendations, based on what they've seen and the evidence we've provided. But there's no police that's coming around to say, busted, right? This is to help us make sure that we're doing the right thing, and to cause us to have the questions that are, being brought up right now.
So the second part is, if that's a possibility, this is a budget meeting, but we're talking a lot about program.
Yeah.
And a lot of this would be sensitive to the greater public, too. People who are not watching TV right now.
Right, but it's there forever.
And I just don't know. What is the process for involving the community, first of all, the staff and you guys and the community, in coming with some generative thinking in the beginning to end up with making some decisions about some of these things? And I ask this out of ignorance, because I'm sure you're doing it, but it sounds like a lot of it is happening now, 4 weeks before you got to have a number.
So I want to go back to, though, this is the conversations that's happening here, but with the principals and with the principals and their staffs, it's year-round. It's not a new conversation for them. And actually, Jean, I think you would say, and Ray, who are on the high school board, and Lynn too, that they've been talking about this for years, right? It's just that, like, you show a slide like this, and it causes people to go, and you have the superintendent who's unwilling to color in, to shade in that little box, because it doesn't feel right to color that in when there's this. But there is lots of opportunity, and there are lots of conversations, and I think those conversations are best had personally, I believe, by the people who work in the system, like the teachers themselves with their administrators, and then to share with the board, here are the conversations, and unless it feels like you've gone left of Pluto, to support that and say, so the connection with the budget is, this is the meeting where the board's hearing, like, here are all the things we're talking about, here's the reality we live in, and we hope that you will support us with resources to continue that work and make the changes that are needed. Colleen?
I was also hearing from both Brendan and Rick, perhaps an ask for some other data points, such as who are the students enrolled in the large classes, where are they academically in their growth, and what are the perceptions of the experience of the students? And I know that you do all sorts of surveys and so forth, but are there students who say, yes, this feels right in this class to have this size? No, it's, I mean, I don't know if we have data.
Well, remember
generally.
Adam did that perception survey last year, and there is a design team of the principals who are working on, they're not calling it a perception survey anymore, they're going to call it engagement, but it asks some of those questions.
But it's their perception of their experience and
How is it going?
opportunities.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Okay. Intervention framework. We rolled this out last year. This was the big project. Yes.
I was gonna say, do we want to just take a quick 5-minute break before we
Yes.
dive into this now that we've gone K-12? And then maybe before we dive into it again.
How about if everybody take a couple 5 minutes? What a great idea.
Are other people wanting to maybe sit down with Mike and figure out how to use the Gmail, our school email account from phones?
Guess what? He's gonna be here next week.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So if he came, if I had, if Mike came maybe 15 minutes early, would you guys make an effort to be here to? That didn't come out right.
Yeah, just to clarify that it's.
Would you be able?
Would you be able to be here?
It's the permission setting for their Gmail and additional emails onto their phones. It's not that they don't know how to use technology.
Well, wait a second. Brendan has, but would
I have
people
great
would appreciate that? Can we
Maybe I'll have Sandy send out a note and we'll make sure. 'Cause I don't want to haul him here and then
have nobody
have
come?
nobody come or come too late to address overwhelming urge. So I'll.
And bring your devices that you have.
Yeah, I think that'd be very helpful, thank you.
Okay. All right. Intervention complete.
Just work-related stuff, or.
Yeah, no other personal issues, just work stuff.
My laptop.
So, intervention framework, you'll remember that last year we had just completed the first part of this work during this budget time. But we were able to implement this. I want to remind you that this is taking a deep dive into one part of the equity autonomy matrix that relates to how do we provide interventions for our kids, how do we lead that, how do we implement that, and how do we provide social emotional learning supports for that. So the first part, well, this first slide just shows how that all works together. Those are the 3 areas. It's really, we believe that the social emotional learning, if you look at the graphic on the right, really surrounds all of it. If kids are in a good place to learn, they're not going to be available for the learning. So that's why we included that. In terms of the evolution of our work, when we started out, we were just talking about interventions from the standpoint of who's leading it, who's telling people what needs to get done, how do we know, and who's doing it. And it was in that process that we went, wow, there's a whole other piece missing here. So the first part of the intervention framework is coaching and coordinating. I'm not going to read all that stuff to you. You can imagine that's the leading part. The people who do that in our system are the literacy and math coordinator and the instructional coaches. The second tier is implementation. That's who's working with the students on whatever intervention is needed. And these people are being directed and coordinated by the coordinators and the coaches. And the people that are in this area are the, paras, both general and specialist paras, and professionals, math and literacy interventionists. And then the social emotional learning, the supports for students that wrap around all of this. The people who are doing this work that are included in this matrix are the behavior coaches, the planning room directors, the specialist paras, school psychologists, social workers, counselors, and SAPs. So that's that whole broad category of people who make sure that when kids are in school that they're available for the learning because the social emotional supports are there for them. So this is what it looks like using next year's numbers, okay? So that very first row, K-8 enrollment, remember, I roll up, I look at kindergarten, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I add in the kindergarten number again. That's how I got to those numbers. Charlotte has 13% of the K-8 population. Heinsberg has 18% of the K-8 population. Shelburne has 27%, and Williston has 37%. And now when you look at those categories that I had mentioned before, coaching and coordination, implementation, social emotional learning, you can see what percentage a school actually will have next year based on the FTEs they have in each of these categories. So let's just take Charlotte as an example here. They have a K-8 enrollment of 350. They are 13% of the K-8 population across our district. And they have 19% of the coaching and coordination. If you add all those numbers across, you get to 100. They have 16% of the implementation money. They have 16% of the social emotional learning number, and in total, they have 17%. So they're a little bit higher than the 13% that they are of the population. Heinsberg, we're at 16%, a teeny bit lower than their 18%. Shelburne at 27%, and what they have is 25, so they're a little bit lower. And Williston is like a smidgen higher. The areas that are in green are the areas that we are actively working on. And I say actively working on, maybe that's Megan and I and Jeff, but more likely it is us with the school administration about what do we need to do here. So, for example, you might remember last year that in this social emotional learning area, in Heinsberg last year, we did not meet EQS for school counseling. And in Charlotte, they had an excess. And so we said, 1 to 2 year plan, we'll see how if we can work this out. And what we did is we took care of the FTEs. So the FTEs, I can confidently say, were in the green, no problem. However, just like everything that's important, it's complicated. And so what we learned fairly early on is that there is a horse of a difference between having a full-time person who's in your school all day long, every day, there for whatever is going on in support to the administration and support to the kids, and having a situation where you have partial person and partial person. And now you're not, it just doesn't provide the level of supports. So we have an issue there that we need to take care of. So we're committed to ensuring that Charlotte will have not more FTE, but will have a full-time FTE. That involves real human beings. You've heard me use that term before. And so that means that we've got to figure that out, right? But we are committed to doing that. So the other area that has come into question around social emotional learning is around SAPs. They're included in that number. And we have 3 of our schools who, for years and years and years and years, dating back to the last century, have had SAPs to meet that standard, right? We have one school, Charlotte, that had an SAP for a while and felt maybe, I think when you were board chair, Lynn, or you were on the board, that there would be a better way to do that. So within that, if you think about it as a closed system, within that closed system, their plan, and Jen, yeah, you're here. Jen might be able to speak to this. Their plan back then was to do a mini comprehensive health kind of framework where you say, okay, here's what, or the prevention framework, here's what needs to get done, who will do it within our system. So perhaps the school nurse is going to do some of it. Perhaps the phys ed teacher is going to do some of it. Perhaps so-and-so who has licensure in health is going to do another part. And then that's pieced together. What happened this year is that they were not able to hire health educators, so there was one part of that that wasn't getting done. But it's my understanding that that is still the model that they prefer, and that there is a big meeting already scheduled to make sure that actually every single one of those components is going to be done. So that gets to the autonomy that we give our principals about, like, how are you going to do this? So it's not that there's a hole there, it's more that there's a different way of doing it. Questions about that? Any of it? Jeff?
So some questions. First of all, just going back to the ratio number that you presented in terms of school counselors and other support staff, 300 students to 1 on FTE. And I'm just wondering where that number comes from.
The education quality standards.
Right, but like, for example, the American School Counselor Association recommends one FTE for every 250 students. So I'm wanting to know where.
So our number comes from the education quality standards, because that was one of the board goals. And that's the document that we live with in Vermont. if the board wanted to, when we get to the end of the budget cycle, say, we want the ratio to be 1 to 250, then we would be able to say to you, this is what that would cost. Because it would be 1 to 250 everywhere, right? So we would need additional counselors in every one of our schools. So that's a board conversation. But for me, in terms of being able to put a check mark by, do we meet this standard? I feel that for school counseling, we do meet the standard.
So I just hold the opinion that I think school counselors have very unique and very specific training that really positions them to be especially effective on a number of different levels, but certainly as we're seeing rising numbers of kids with more intensive needs, for example, and kids who really require, this district has invested a lot of time and energy in developing a trauma-informed philosophy, and at the heart of that, as we all know, is relationship, and building relationship. And I think that one of the things that as we talk about these numbers, and I understand that this is just how budgets need to come together, but one of the things at this level that we don't get to see is that when counselors are removed out of the system, the loss that takes place in terms of the less opportunity for one-to-one relationship building that I think goes on from people who are particularly skilled, when you look at their training, to be able to provide services to students that no one else with dissimilar skills can provide. And so I just find it, when we look at our board goals, a number of those goals really do move to looking at adequate students' support systems. And it feels to me that school counselors are central to many of the student support offerings that we have, and yet it feels to me like over time, while we're increasing in some schools, like in Heinsberg, which is really good, we're also reducing in other schools.
Well, that was really a matter of the equity issue, right? So in the end, Heinsberg wasn't meeting the school quality, education quality standards by a chunk, not a little bit, by a big chunk.
Right.
And Charlotte overmet that particular standard. Now, I would just throw it back. This is a board conversation. Really, like, if you convince the board that you should have another goal, that is, we want to follow the national standards for school counseling, that wouldn't be to me that you'd make that argument. Because I feel like we do meet that goal. I feel like when I meet with principals, and specifically the Charlotte situation, what I hear from those principals is, and I understand this, it makes sense to me, having a full-time person in your school who's there every day that you can take it to the bank, unless they're sick or you know that they are off on training that you've signed off on, they're going to be there. It's not really, it just doesn't work. Not for all the reasons that you've said, but it does meet school education quality standards.
But from a practical standpoint, for example, if you take one school counselor for what would be 9 grades at Charlotte,
Yeah.
and you look just at the amount of time that the school counselor has to spend in student meetings of concern for students, and other professional requirements. I mean, you begin to look at the amount of one-to-one time that is left to them to be able to work with an individual student or student groups or maybe with a family. It feels like that time becomes very limited. It's also, that's a lot of grades for one person to be able to.
Yeah, I know, but I'm thinking that that's for you to convince your colleagues about.
I think it's in a way, it's similar to the conversations that we've had about essential arts with our music and our world language, in the sense is that there's a lot of different ways to do it. Are our outcomes the same? And I don't know the answer to, do we do 1 to 250, 1 to 300? Because I think as a board, what we want to know is are the interventions that we have in place effective. And if they're not, then maybe that's when we need to look. And I think that's maybe where some of this year-round piece comes in.
Yeah, and can I just interject and then I'll just say, that model that I showed you, I think would begin to address that too, right? When you have a more cohesive structure around groups and families of children.
You're talking the team, that
That
team
team,
structure.
yeah, then and with a behavioral support there, I think that starts to address some of that.
Just getting back to Jeff's original question about the 300 versus 250, and the national standards changed in the past 10 years, moving down from 3, and the state did not follow. But I think your broader point about how are those professional skills connected to our mission and our goals for the board to provide what we can for kids within a budget that people will adopt. To me, that's a question, it connects with a lot of different issues, the unified arts, counseling, number of different areas that, to me, that's a retreat topic that I think that we could have some rich discussion about, because there would be budget drivers related to outcome of that discussion, but I appreciate the point that you're bringing forward, and thank you for doing that. I don't know if we're going to solve it this year, but I would hope that we could have a retreat discussion about it.
And I think, not to diminish equity, because that's been a huge focus, and we need to get there, and I think that's the first step. But then I think there's a step after that that says, okay, now we've got equity, but is it doing what we want it to do? Is it enough?
Right.
And we haven't even started looking at that.
Right.
That's where we'll start to get the indicator piece. I mean, I think it's coming.
And I think there is the piece, though, that we do know that the way we resolved the equity piece last year isn't working perfectly. That's why that's shaded, and we're still looking at that, because it isn't working perfectly. There's no one that's going to say it is. So we're looking at that piece. The part that, and actually we've had an experience like that in the special ed world, where we had split people and realized it really didn't work, and when we stopped doing that, we found a workaround. We didn't add FTE, we just found a workaround. It made a huge difference. So I think it's a good idea to have it as a retreat topic, because it does seem that it focuses around what the board wants to support. But again, I'm making the presentation that is within the constructs of what the board says that number is and what we already have. This is what it looks like. And I've already said to you, I'm nervous about some parts of this.
Okay, so that was going to be, I have a list of things Elaine is nervous about. It's different than what
You've already
Brendan
heard it
can't do.
already?
Well, you said
I
parent
sent you the
ratio.
document, so you saw them.
No. So that was,
Anything else about this? And this is really 1 year old, right?
that was my question. Is this an area that makes you nervous? Is this one of the things?
Not
No, because you
really.
think there's
We
an
feel like,
answer.
when I talk to my colleagues, today we had CVSD, and a colleague said, hey, could you meet with me to talk to me about that, right? So I know that this is good work that we're doing in terms
Okay.
of figuring it out and being able to display it in a way that is illuminating. I think that's good. And that we have, within the constraints of a closed system, the opportunity to move things around. And can I give a shout out to those people that are sitting there? Because I can tell you that sometimes what that means is taking from one and giving to the other, and instead of coming to the table and saying, oh no, that's mine, I'm just hanging on to it, they come in a problem-solving, headset and work together for all of the kids. And I think that's extraordinary, and they deserve really kudos for that, and publicly thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, this is an awesome conversation. I like how detailed we're getting, but one of the things that I want to just point out and remind the board is, remember where we were last year? And, we talk about there's that constant work in progress. This is our second year of being a unified district, and I'm very proud to see these slides, because I remember there was a lot more things that were not green or not highlighted last year. So I think that the entire board is definitely dedicated to equity, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what that looks like and how to accomplish that.
Okay. Board goal, equity autonomy, the administrator ratios. That is also an educator quality standard, and that's an old standard. I mean, that's been there forever. Even as they rolled into new ones, they kept the same standard. If you have a school of 10, you have to have a full-time principal, 10 full-time teachers, a full-time administrator, and then as many more as you need in order to be able to do the job description of a principal. So for us, that means we have 2 co-principals in Charlotte. They each work 210 days, so that's the equivalent of 1.8 FTE. I will take a moment to say that in our smaller schools, the principals take on more other stuff, right? So even though it's not reflected in the equity autonomy, not the equity autonomy, the intervention framework, they do some of that coordination and leading because they can. Heinsberg also has 2 co-principals, each working 210 days, and that's 1.8 FTE. Shelburne has 2 full-time. Yes, Russ?
Just out of curiosity, who's in Heinsberg and Charlotte during those 50 days?
So it's in the summer.
Somebody comes and knocks on the door.
Nobody's home. Go away. It's in the summer, mostly, and it's school vacations. And, right?
But there is nobody there. I mean, and clearly in the other buildings, they're expected to show up.
Well, they also,
somebody's showing
yeah,
up.
but 260 days isn't every day of the year either.
Yeah.
People have vacations, and right?
But are we just mothballing the buildings?
We've never had, you know, this has been going on for a long time, and we've never had a problem. Let's just say that, because you know what? They can call the central office, and we'll pitch in, won't we?
We're here.
We're here. Shelburne has 2 co-principals, full-time. Allenbrook, you know, also, you'll notice on this page, I also mentioned the special ed administrator, because that is also somewhat unique to our district and a very smart thing. So in many big districts like ours, all of them except us, I think, at this point, though, some are also interested in this. What they do is they have the special ed administration all at the central office. So instead of having a half-time special ed administrator in Charlotte and Heinsberg and then a full-time one in Shelburne and Williston and CVU, they have them all at the central office. We think this is a much, much better model. And somebody a colleague just asked Megan last week or this week, said, do you think that the reason that our per pupil costs in special ed are at the average or lower, which is in Chittenden County, pretty amazing. And this colleague said, do you think it's because of the school-based administration? It could be, you know, like they have a better look at what is really needed and how it might be, how we might support kids in other ways than, you know, a costly intervention.
Before you move off
Yes.
that slide, can I just get back to Russ's question? The 210 versus the 260, and my recollection is that that's sort of a holdover from our old budget cycles where we were developing it independently.
Yes, yep.
And it might be helpful for us, because I don't think I could talk with any credibility to a community member about why there are differences and what's the coverage and what do people do on those 50 days versus the not having 50 days.
Well, just
and I know there's overlap, and I'm simplifying.
But I also want to say, in a principal's life, there is more than 260 days a year worth of work. So to figure out, right?
No, we just need some simple.
Right. So what I do say to
how the overlap happens, and
so what I do say to the principals who work 0.9, that I don't expect them to work more than those number of days. Understanding that we all work all the time, right? I mean, that's just kind of a reality. So what I'm just saying is I don't want to take advantage of anybody, right? If we're hiring them to be 1.9, there's flexibility in their schedule that there isn't for those principals that are working full-time. So I do have those conversations with them about, like, does this seem to be right or not? These decisions were made by old boards when they thought that the ratios, which I'll show next, didn't warrant having more than that.
Yeah.
But, again, that's a board level discussion.
And there was, you know, when we did it, there was overlap, so it wasn't like the buildings were vacant.
There's still
At
not.
one point, we had overlap of who was in the building, that there was some coverage. And it might not be that both principals are on site every day. So we could
Right.
just use some help in understanding what the map looks like, perhaps.
Okay. So here are the ratios. So, again, that first row here is just how many FTE of administration they have, what the state average is, K-8, and student administrator ratio, so administrator to student, you can see there's a variation there, and then teacher to administrator ratio. And so just keep in mind that these are the people that they supervise. So that's not all the faculty and all the people that they have in their schools. Those are the professional staff that they need to supervise. So I also linked the most recent teacher ratio information from the state. Questions about that?
Is there a number, that would look at, I know we're the biggest school system in the state, I think we are, but, that would compare these numbers to the South Burlingtons and Essex and
So Essex is the
whatever.
yeah, Essex and
Rather than a
Burlington are
statewide
assessed.
average where, you've got all the
Yes.
rural.
Yeah, you
small-
can get that.
Okay.
Yep, I could get that. Any other questions about this one?
I just want to say
Yes,
to Russ
back to that.
if you take 52.17 weeks and multiply it times 5 days, it's 263 days.
Is
So
it?
it's the full year. So,
And then they get vacation.
right, so they're like paid full-time plus, including their vacation
Yeah.
days. Okay.
So,
Make sure.
yes, Ray?
Where do the coaches? Practical matter of if somebody shows up. Coaches, math coaches.
So that, they're in the staffing. They're in the staff. They're not administrators.
210 days.
So, last board goal, ... at a cost the community can support, right? So this is important because, Jeff, when you say to me, well, it should be 2.5, or you say to me, well, the school is empty when the administrators aren't there, or somebody else says, whatever it is, it's like, well, here's the slide that keeps things where they are, right? So if the board thought that the cost the community could support was higher than that 2.8, I'd have, we could do something with that. But right now, to stay within that, remember the board gives us a number and says, figure it out. The number you gave us this year actually was lower. And Jean came back to you and said, we can't do it. We did it last year, God knows how, but we did it last year, but we couldn't do it this year. So this is, the level at which we can do it. So it's that, for us in general ed, we are at 2.7%. Reminder that special ed at 3.3%, there will be corresponding revenues that right now don't show up. So that'll have an impact on your tax rate and what the equalized per pupil will be. So, and you'll hear from Jean next week. So for a total of, 2.8% is what all of this is looking like right now. And then what it all means. So you've heard all of this, I'm just recapturing it for you. It means that we are adding 2 teachers at ABS and we're reducing 3 teachers, one in Shelburne, one in Heinsberg, one in Charlotte. Actually, that's based on enrollment, and there's going to be some creativity in that, but it's not. That's not one of the things I'm really worried about. We're adding 0.2 FTE library, and we're going to offset that with a go-get at ABS. We're hiring a school resource officer. We've got RISE materials at CVU that we're supporting. Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit?
RISE material.
Material, like what that.
It's 60K, it's actually, half of that is staffing and half of it is materials.
Oh.
Everything from pens to papers and things that they need to maintain
30K.
Well, so
It's not-
remember.
It's not administrative materials, it's things that the kids may
will
need
use
to do
in the
their
work that
projects.
they're doing in that 2 weeks at the end of the year, that every student is going to be doing something, right?
So just,
There's,
It's 1/5 or whatever,
1/6.
teacher,
I
six
think it's
teachers
1/6.
to,
coordinate,
yeah,
organize.
so,
the positions were partially funded out of Innovation Fund in the year we're in now.
Right.
But then,
But for next year, it will not be. That's why there's an ad for this year.
Right.
So-
And previous
Correct.
to that, the roll-in funding.
right.
so I want to be clear on process, and RISE presents a good opportunity, because it did come out of the Innovation Fund. And my understanding is that, the Innovation Fund pays for 1 year, and then as it continues on, it replaces something else. We're not just going to keep adding $100,000 worth of programs every year based on what was found in the Innovation Fund. And if that's the case of RISE, I guess my question is, where is that money going to come from? What is it replacing if it's considered an Innovation Fund project, which I'm not sure it is. I think it's more of a curriculum piece, which is fine. And in our policy, curriculum falls to the superintendent to design, implement, unless there's a cost. And if there's a cost associated with it, it comes back to the board. So I guess my question is, are we innovation funding? Are we curriculum? And if it's curriculum, I just think the board needs to recognize that this is a curriculum decision that's being brought to us that will become an ongoing expense. It's not replacing something else. So I guess that's my question to you.
Well, the one thing, Lynn, is that theoretically, everything in the Innovation Fund will become curriculum at some point. That these aren't, the Innovation Fund isn't necessarily just extras that we want to do for fun, right? They're supposed to be advancing student learning, which is.
Right.
So things that are successful will become part of the budget.
But my understanding is, and because I asked this at the executive committee meeting, is, are we supplanting or supplementing with the Innovation Fund? And I thought the answer I got was that we were supplanting.
Well, I think it gets back to this. You're asking us to come in at 2.7, and we're doing it and including those things from the innovation funds that we think have merit and are going to provide better educational opportunities. So we're not coming in at 2.7 and said, oh, well, besides that, we'd also, like as a decision packet, would like these other things. So in a way, think of it this way. We could say to Adam, okay, well, they took that out, and he could say, okay, well, now I've got my budget, and now I'd rather have that than. Partly because RISE is something that they're doing for the first time this year with students. Every student at CVU, 1,307 I think it is, will be doing this. There's some organization that goes behind that, and they're in year 1. So they're gonna learn a lot. They'll have a lot of data at the end of this year about how that worked, how well received it was by the students, whether or not, what needs to get fixed. But it would be hard in 1 year, in the very first year, to know, is this something that we really should embrace and get passionate about because it checks off a lot of things we really care about, or not? And we don't know that now, so.
But just to be clear then, if RISE is an Innovation Fund project, it is not intended to be replace anything else. So the money will always be added to the budget for Innovation Fund projects?
Not necessarily.
So, at the Finance Committee, we had a lot of discussion around this, and Jean, can you jump in at any time if I misstate something? So, the Innovation Fund's fairly new. This is the second year of the Innovation Fund, so we're still developing it. And one of the things we just discussed at the Finance Committee is what you said earlier. We just can't keep adding $100,000 to the budget every year. So what needs to happen, and I believe there's a group of administrators and principals working on developing a set of standards that will allow them to measure the outcome of a program that they use innovation funds for, and then also deliver that to the board for us to make a decision. I think that the first year or two of the innovation funds, we're developing it because when we didn't know what we didn't know when we started it. And that's kind of where RISE is falling in. So I don't necessarily think RISE is a, you know, a good example of what's going to happen every single time we use innovation funds to move something into the budget. I think RISE is a perfect example of what we need to do to tighten up the innovation fund and measure the programs we're putting in there.
So then can you so then next year, I'm assuming RISE will come back, the innovation funds will always become like a little separate fund, and RISE will come back with another 60, and then we'll have data that we measure it against?
So I think that's what the principals and administration's working on right now to try to figure that out. So we really are working hard to develop the innovation fund, so it's not just $100,000 that we're giving away every year, but something that's meaningful and something that we can measure. Okay. I don't necessarily feel confident saying that we're there yet, but I can confidently say, from what I'm hearing, I think we'll get there.
Mm-hmm. And it is possible. There is a design team that's doing this. Jean sits on that design team. Adam sits on that design team. There's somebody from, I think, each of the schools developing the process and also developing the parameters. And so lots of really good conversations about like what's innovative, what isn't. Does it have to be a one-year thing, or can it be something that goes on? And it's possible that if we had been this far into the work, that RISE might not have gotten money this year, right? But early on, we didn't have a whole lot of people putting things in, and we hadn't had all of those really good conversations yet about how should this work. But that is what we're developing. And
so this is kind of a leap of faith.
Yes.
We're taking a leap
right,
of
but
faith.
it's a leap of faith based on people's doing really
Right, we'll get the data for it.
Yeah.
But it's no different from professional development for a new math program. You know, it's just like schools always have to be innovating and learning and testing things out, and if it doesn't work, it gets abandoned at some point. And I think that's might be the question, is will things just, you know, the question of will things just get added, and at what point does something else go away? You know, with a closed system, at some point,
something has to.
There have to be changes in the way that we distribute money.
And I just want to caution, though, as we look through this and when we get ready to launch the budget and the public starts to look through the bits and pieces, I just want to caution that that we really understand and articulate what our innovation fund is and how those programs will be measured, because what I don't want to see is like, well, I'm a supporter of the innovation fund and this might be a great program. To me, looking like, oh, what's this RISE materials versus 3 teachers that are being reduced, or world language that's being reduced. That creates its own narrative, and I'm concerned about that.
Right. 2 teachers in ABS, one new
kindergarten.
But we already added a kindergarten last year.
And they were still at 20.
They were still at 20, so we're adding another kindergartner and a first grade teacher.
Right. And you saw their ratios there in
Yeah.
with all the others. Yeah. In a way, that's good news, right? When you get to the very end and you have to calculate what the tax rates are going to be and what your per pupil expenditure is, having more kids come in is a good thing, right? That helps.
Plus, I get this.
Yeah.
This operations section here?
Yes, you're going to hear that next week.
Excellent, okay.
Yes, Jean is going to do that one. She's going to be standing up here. So back to this chart, we're adding 0.5 social studies teacher at CVU for all the reasons that we had the big discussion about earlier. And they are cutting world language. It's Latin and
I think a section of French.
a section of French.
Undersubscribed.
They're undersubscribed, yeah. It's
Wait,
not,
all of Latin or
No.
just one section or sections?
I think it's 1 or 2 sections.
We are adding 1.0 FTE at CVU in math, again, for the big, robust conversation we had earlier about all those big class sizes.
That one got missed on the sheet you're
Yes,
looking
I'm
at, so
sorry
you might want to
about
write
that.
it on there.
I added it as you were coming in here this evening. What is it?
Math. One and
They're
two.
adding a rowing and mountain bike club, and that's just based on, I don't know exactly how clubs come into being, but I think it's student interest first, and then when they have enough kids that are interested, then they add it.
And it's small, that's small money.
Yeah.
That's
And
That's great.
I just made a side comment to Jean about, this looks really heavy on CVU, but going back to your earlier comment about how we're trying to get the per pupil cost equal at all the schools, CVU is
Is
it
0.5
has a lower
social
cost
studies
per pupil
enough?
than other schools.
Right, and that's unusual.
Okay.
That is unusual, and, you know, if you looked at the state data, high schools usually are more expensive per pupil than, that's why they give us more money for the high school. That's what they asked for.
That's what they asked for.
That's what they asked for?
Yeah.
You know what, they take more. It's again, back to the other slide, what you want this slide to look like. Depending on what you want that slide to look like, determines what happens here.
Though I have to say, Elena, maybe, I think I'm just, maybe just because it's coming at me in a different way, but the discussions I've heard around the Colt table, if there was something that we passionately needed for this system, we would go above the number, as we are, right? We're a little above the number. So the having a target that's difficult to meet has certainly put a very sharp pencil in a lot of, we've had tough conversations with principals about having to push back. If it came to hurting the system, we would come and tell you, we need more money.
Well, so I'm gonna go there next. Sorry about that, I
these are not the-
apologize.
Elaine's
But you know what,
concerns?
the very next thing on here, well, we're gonna increase sub pay, because we can't get subs, and I hear, even on the streets, that everybody else pays subs more than we do. So we need to do something about that, so we're gonna do that. But then I get to here. Whoops, sorry. $95,000 go get for K-8. I've said this to Jean every which way, you know, she knows. I don't know where that's coming from. I have no clue where I'm gonna find the $95,000. So I just want you all to know that, because 80% of the money is in staffing. And I think that we have an issue with paras in Charlotte. So instead of that $95,000 go-get, I'd like to say, we probably should do something to start fixing that in Charlotte. But that's just me. I know I've said it more than people want to hear it, but it makes me nervous, because it's not like I'm sitting there going, I think like 6 more teachers are going to retire, or I think that, you know, somebody's going to say, I don't need one of my paras, right? I don't know how we're going to make that, and maybe it's a 1 to 2 year thing in terms of the paras in Charlotte, but the $95,000 go-get, I might, you know, like I tease Megan, can you help me out here? Right? It's really, that is something you need to know. And again, it goes back to, in my mind, it goes back to this slide, right there. That's on there to get us to that number. Not because I think that I know where I'm getting it. And questions? Yes, Russ, of course.
Two things that I thought I've heard along the way in these meetings. One is that there is a potential K position in Shelburne that you're kind of holding on to in your back pocket, may or may not need.
Right.
So that's, you know, a
That could be that 95.
That's
Jean
a
wants to
certain
hear
amount of
that.
money
You
with
hear that?
The K
salary and
position in
budget.
Shelburne.
You know,
I
the
said you've
95
got that.
K could be addressed by the position that we're holding in the budget.
And I also
That's
heard
true.
somewhere along the way that we are anticipating higher tech expenses because of Tariff Man's
Yes.
trade war with China, which may or may not happen, or maybe we buy fewer machines, or, you know, or something. So, you know, both of those, I think, are fairly big-ticket items.
No, actually, we took hardware out to fit the tariffs in, so I
So,
But I get your point.
so in other words, you've
already
already
addressed
said instead of buying X number of machines, you're gonna reduce that to Y number of machines, if the tariffs actually do happen.
if they do.
But if the tariffs don't happen, then, and you buy the same number of machines, we've saved money.
Yes, we'd be behind the 8 ball as far as the machines, but yes, no worse off. Yeah, and that's why this, at this point, it's kind of a go-get. It's not a,
Yep.
you know, Elaine's not saying I'm taking out a teacher in the school, despite my best judgment. She's saying, like, you know, this is what we need to make the numbers as best as we can. It's a reasonable number, given that we've got a little more time to look at stuff.
Brendan?
Since Russ was talking about tariffs and stuff that was brought up during Jean's presentation 2 weeks ago, we also had a increase of insurance that if you think about it, if you add those two numbers up there, are pretty close to what we're asking Lane to go find. And that insurance increase, at least for me, who was helped with the budget last year, I didn't expect to see that big of an increase this year.
The health insurance.
The health insurance, yes. So, you know, I think that, you know, this year is just kind of a interesting year because, you know, what made this budget so hard is that there's a lot of things in here that we can't control. Tariffs, health insurance. There's a significant increase for us that if we didn't experience, we wouldn't be coming with this high of a budget and a go-get request for the administration.
I guess I'd offer to my fellow board members, my personal, I'm uncomfortable with go-gets that are likely to cut into classroom teachers and instructional, like our strong instructional leaders. And looking at most of the ratios we've seen throughout the night, we're within EQS, but I think we're in a good range. We aren't way below in a lot of places where there are easy cuts. And so for me, is there a you know, to hit a certain percentage spot on versus to say this is the actual need and the percentage, you know, rounds to the next decimal place, or there's a little bit more there. I have a hard time justifying in a budget this big to talk about cutting a teacher or two over without seeing what that impact is on the overall budget. And then I will say, as a secondary point, I'm a little concerned. I think that the principle of the RISE program is fantastic. It's a very innovative, it's a neat idea. I think it's puts us in a little bit of a challenging position because it feels a little bit like, okay, so we're gonna have this sort of new innovative thing that happens within the school year at the high school, and yet we're also gonna have to make some cuts in classroom teachers, and that, I know it isn't really an apples to apple, but to see those on the same ledger like that, and to talk about like 30,000 in materials for students to do these projects in the last couple of weeks, again, if money were no object, an amazing thing, but relative to teachers and to class size ratios, that makes me uncomfortable.
Can I want to make sure we're all talking the same numbers and we're looking at the same increase. So the board started with 2.3. It was using old indicators. We're thinking the 2.6 is really the number that the board should approve at next week's meeting, but that's the number. 2.6 is what we gave to the administration came back. We said, try and hit this one. They came back with 2.8, which gives them about 168,000 over the target 2.6. Of that 168,000, 95 of that is a go-get that has yet to be identified. Is that what you're?
No.
No, it's beyond.
No, that's
It's
beyond
beyond.
the 2.8.
So what you're saying is that that to the 2.8 is 168 over, the 95 would put us above the 2.8. Got it. Okay. I wanted to make sure we were all
So
at the same.
if we include that 95 as a board, if we decide to put that $95,000 into the budget, the percent increase would roughly be 3 point, do you remember what that was?
No.
It would be, I think it would be close, if not around the 3 mark, which is higher than any of the indexes that we decided as a board last year we wanted to try to keep our budget to.
What's our total budget again?
79 million.
79, so, you know, let's say 80 million.
Well,
So
well,
a
point two,
percentage
actually,
point
point
is
two was
what?
100
Yeah.
was 168, right? So
Yeah.
it's about 80,000
Yeah.
for a point.
For a point.
Yeah,
So.
that's where I was
So it'd
going.
be
Thank you.
2.9.
And I know there's a lot of numbers and there's a lot to keep in our head, but the reason that we're over budget and we have go-gets is that we're trying to triangulate on what the special ed revenue is gonna do ahead of having the special ed revenue. We're kind of, I'm pretty confident that we can get to the 2.6 target with special
With
ed
net.
revenue, but if we start adding things, then I can't do both. So that's, I'm all for it, but, Elaine, just to make sure it's clear, because I'm hearing two different things, is that the teacher reductions are class size driven.
Their class size, yeah.
So they're gonna happen regardless of whether we add.
Right.
That goes back to the board goal of use our class size policy and EQS. And if we kept those teachers in, we'd have to add teachers to keep it equal, right? That's that other piece that plays out there.
And since these are kindergarten classes, the board should know that's a risk built into our, we're taking out 3 younger grade teachers. If kindergarten classes come in big, we'll have to put them back. And we only budgeted for 1 put back, so that's just sort of a risk that's
And then in
kinda
July, we'll
inherent.
have a conversation, or June, we'll have a conversation.
About
We do.
Where do we find the money for
where
the
we found the money,
kindergarten?
yep, yep. Since Russ has already spent my technology budget.
I didn't spend it, I'm just saying
No,
that
you're
seems
you're
to be.
absolutely right, you're absolutely right.
Any other questions or comments?
Jeff?
I have another
Yes.
question. I'm certainly going to be accused of beating a dead horse tonight. So in terms of additions and reductions, you're maintaining the same FTE for SAPs as well as school counselors for next year, is that correct? But is there an addition or a reduction in any particular school for school counselors or SAPs?
SAPs, we don't know. So that could be, that's gonna be part of the big conversation, so that could happen. We don't know about that one. School counselors, there's no additional school counselors. But we will work on what I was saying before, that we have a full-time school counselor, 5 days a week in Charlotte. That might mean moving people around. We know these are real human beings that are gonna be impacted by this. We have to make our decisions and make our plans based around what's best for our kids. We know that. So I don't know if that comes out loud and clear to you, but I can tell you that every conversation we have is always about that. Like, I think we care as much as you do, Jeff, about like making sure that our kids have all the supports they have. We do care about that. And when we see that something isn't working as well as it could, we talk about it, we problem solve, we see what we can do, and if there's an action to be taken, we take it. So around SAP, there's more conversation to be had. Not sure exactly where that's gonna land. Like I said, there's a big meeting coming up, I don't know, is it next week? The end of this week. To discuss how are we doing all of this and to ensure to ourselves that the way we're doing it is going to work for kids.
I think that's good because, I mean, when you think about SAPs, for example, if we're teaching, if we're utilizing curricula for prevention education in our schools that is research-based, they're usually, in order to have the kind of outcome that is projected, one needs to deliver that material in the manner in which it's been tested and prescribed.
With fidelity.
Right, with fidelity. And so if you're cobbling together the teaching of that information by pulling individuals from various backgrounds who don't have that kind of training and expertise, particularly in a subject area that I just think is so critically important these days, I find that very worrisome. And I find it very worrisome that Charlotte does not have an SAP and has not had an SAP. And I'm not sure how that, just not sure how that happened. And the other thing that I just want to comment on is that one of the things that I find in the first year of going through this is that this budget is so large, and so many of you here have worked so hard in putting this budget together, and I really do appreciate that immensely. But I think what's difficult is that having the responsibility to vote on this budget when there's not the opportunity to have sort of a line-by-line opportunity to see what's here and what isn't here as much as I wish I might have, and maybe that's available to me. But all of us have to construct budgets in our lives, and we all have to make priorities. So if I'm passionate about the fact that I believe that school social workers hold a unique place within our, school counselors, hold a unique place within our school system to maintain a robust system of support for students, then if I had the opportunity to just manage that budget by myself, I'd be looking down for other places to be able to make cuts. And there's lots of discussions that go on, but I'm not a part of those discussions. And so it's just, I find it somewhat challenging, because you have to come forward with sort of end results of what you think is best, end points. And I appreciate that. And logistically and practically, that's what has to happen. But it just feels like there are some, and I think about this particularly with prevention education, for example, that there are just some critical areas that I think are not adequately covered, or I think we've had some areas that have been very well covered, but now we're removing sometimes resources, like we've done in Charlotte with school counselors. And I think that the day-to-day impact of that doesn't necessarily come here. And we can discuss this as a board, we'll come to this hopefully and have these discussions, but we're going to make decisions, and we're going to make this decision in January. So that's going to impact students for the next year and a half. It's going to be a year and a half. If we make any changes of any kind, that's a long way out. There are going to be a lot of kids, for example, leaving middle school in Charlotte right now who will not have had the prevention education that they should have had. And there is so much rich research that demonstrates that if you start that education early on, and it has to be repetitive year after year, it has an impact on decision-making in adolescence and adulthood. We've missed that opportunity. And what I'm not hearing is how that's going to be recouped. What I am hearing, understandably, is that these are board discussions that need to take place. But we're going to have that discussion after this budget is finalized. And it's a long time to wait, I think. So I don't feel like I'm articulating very well tonight what I'm trying to express, but being outside of these conversations, but still having to then make the decision about whether or not this budget makes the most sense for our communities, most of all for our students. For me, there feels like a bit of a disconnect, that I wish that there could be more opportunity for detailed discussions, an opportunity for input as the decisions are being made before the decisions have been finalized, because it feels like a lot of these decisions are finalized at this point.
I think, I think I hear a lot of Aaron in what you're saying, because it goes, and we haven't done it. And part of it's because we're just getting rolling with this. But you're right, as a board, we haven't looked at the outcomes. We don't know it. And I need to preface this by saying, I do believe our kids are getting an amazing, excellent, quality education. We just, as a board, haven't sat down and looked at the proof of that. And so you're right, we are making a decision, we're making decisions on budgets without having those indicators to prove to us that, yeah, we can have this set up for supports for our kids, or have 14 classes with 25 plus kids in social studies. We don't have those indicators to then turn back to the administration and say, okay, this is what we want you to do in terms of numbers, and here are the things we really want you to focus on, because look, we're not doing such a great job at this. But we haven't pulled that together yet. It's a work in progress, and I think it's a key missing piece, and that's what I hear when I'm hearing you talk. I understand your frustration. I know Aaron and others have probably had a similar one. Okay, I'll stop talking. Go ahead.
Well, and I just want to say, someone who's also new to the board, I will say, though, that although maybe the entire board hasn't been having pretty detailed discussions, I will say that with regards to the finance committee, that Jean has come. I mean, she's not literally, it's not line by line by line, but she's been coming. Well, it's not every other week. I mean, once a month.
It seems like once a month.
Every week, it feels like.
Every week.
But I mean, she's been having very detailed discussions with us about the things that have to happen, the things that they're looking at. I mean, she originally came to the committee with, I think it was like 3.3%, and then talking about where are these cuts going to happen. And so although it's not happening with the larger board, and it's just because there's not enough time in general for everything, like we can't all be on every committee or whatnot. I think part of it is too just knowing that, I don't know, maybe trusting in the process that our our peers are representing us, and we are doing the work. So although we're not getting a line by line, the committee knows a lot, and we've seen a lot of the detail and helped Jean kind of hone in on what we thought that the board in general was was important. I'm fumbling, but important, and what the focus should be.
I think Russ said
Russ,
it.
I know. Gotta look this way.
I won't repeat what Jocelyn just said about the committees, but I think you really hit the nail on the head with that. The other thing that I think Elaine has been stressing tonight is the amount of input that she's getting from each of the leadership teams in our buildings. And so in Charlotte, if there's a particular issue, I assume they had the opportunity to say, this is more of a priority for us than something else. And, we can't address everything every year. If you looked at some of the ratio numbers, a lot of the ratio numbers for Charlotte were more favorable than they are in some of the other in some of the other buildings. So, would they be willing to give up somewhere else to get what you're talking about? I think we have to trust the professionals in the building to look at those things and to prioritize those and to carry that message to Elaine and her team.
Sometimes I feel that, with the exception of people who are on the finance committee, everyone feels that the finance committee is sitting down and going line by line and picking where we want to move things or where we personally want to focus. So the finance committee's goals are developed and what we try to do by the people who are sitting around this table. So what we do is we take conversations throughout the year and information that we receive from our retreat and feedback from the administration and try to build a budget that hits all of those things. So I think that you have a very good concern that needs to be addressed, but I'd almost argue that that's a concern that needs to be addressed at the board level and not in a finance committee. Because we need, as a finance committee, we need direction from the larger board on how to budget for things and where to move. So if the finance committee says, or if the board says we want X in every single school, then it's a finance committee's responsibility along with administration to figure out how that works, but not necessarily make those decisions. Because we'd all have Ferraris or something if it was all
Really? Any other questions or comments, or Erin?
Do we have any sense where the 95 K8 or the 30,000 CVU go get might come from?
I don't.
Computers and Shelburne kindergarten teacher.
Well, yes.
Food service.
If we don't end up needing the kindergarten teacher, done,
Yeah.
right? But otherwise, I don't know. I think Adam does have some ideas. I don't know what they are. You know, I don't even know what they are. I mean, because we say to him, here's what you've got, figure that out.
I think historically, you look at the numbers, and we've run, we've run surpluses practically every year that I've been on the board, and that's going on 12 years. Collectively across, we were separate districts once upon a time. So I think that, the administration and the various iterations of it have always done a very good job managing the finances, and fortunately, we've never run a huge deficit. I don't know that we've ever run a deficit, period. And the fact of the matter is that's why we have a fund balance. If by chance, I doubt it's going to happen, but if by chance we ran over budget, there is a fund balance. So, I think that we, again, trust that the administration, is looking for those things, and they historically have found them.
Anything else? Okay, well, maybe next week is operations. Maybe we'll find $95,000 in operations. Food services in that discussion.
You're not borrowing from maintenance.
We're not borrowing from maintenance. Okay, we're not done. We're not done. But this will be fast.
Are we done with
We're done with the budgets. We're done with the budget buddies. We're almost quickly done because we just have consent agendas, the consent agenda. So, but budget buddies are welcome to leave.
Thank you, Elaine, for that presentation.
Thank you.
That was very good, Lee. chair.
Can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any abstentions? Okay. The next meeting is, next week.
Same time, same place. Oh, wait,
No,
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock, and it is in room 140 next week, which is when you first walk in the door on your right-hand side.
Otherwise, it's.
And we'll get an email out. Sandy will send an email out to the board members to see who wants some tech help with Mike, and we'll have a session with Mike ahead of time. Okay, and then after the 18th, we'll give you a break for Christmas and the New Year, and then we'll be back here on January 8th and the 22nd. Okay, I guess we adjourn after executive session. Do I have a motion to go into executive session for negotiations, which I need Aaron and Brendan for? I need you guys to come into this one. The motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay. We'll go next door. It'll be fairly quick.